Hi everyone, and welcome back to Comics and the Graphic Novel. This is going to be our second week video, which is going to talk about the history of comics and comic books. Specifically, we're going to be focusing a little more on American comics history in this particular presentation. We'll talk a little bit more about international comics later on this semester. But in general, when we talk about comics history and comics criticism and comic studies, in America we tend to focus on American comics. And really in general, we talk about that in a world context, we're still often talking American comics because they are probably the most influential on the rest of the world, although in the past, couple of decades, Japanese manga has really raced into the forefront of that and is giving American comics a run for their money. But certainly for most of the 20th century, American comics were exported to the rest of the world in ways that other comics were not necessarily exported as thoroughly. So this particular history of comics is going to be a little American-centric, but we will be kind of counteracting that by talking more about different kinds of international comics from different other places and their influence later on this semester. In addition, since we are talking about American comics, you kind of can't talk about American comics without talking about superheroes. They are kind of one of the cores of comics. There's a reason that, for example, when we talk about comic book movies, we usually aren't thinking about movies like Road to Perdition, about kind of a mafia underworld, or we're not talking about 300 usually, about the Spartans in classical Greece, or a version thereof. We're usually not talking about even something like Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which is based on indie comic. When we talk about comic book movies, we're usually talking about like Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, X-Men, Avengers, superheroes. So talking about American comics is kind of inextricably tied with talking about superhero comics. That's definitely not all of the comics we'll be talking about, but specifically I want to bring that up because when we talk about American comics, we tend to divide it into sort of ages. And this is the case for a lot of things that we look at, looking backwards historically. A lot of things we talk about having, golden ages and silver ages and bronze ages and such. Comics is no different, but the interesting thing about that for American comics is it is very much patterned on what's going on with superhero comics, even as they're also reflecting other changes outside of the superhero world. So if it seems a little superhero comics heavy, it's kind of unavoidable, but if you don't love superhero comics, we are reading things other than superhero comics, so don't freak out too much just yet. So when we talk about comics history, we're going to start off by talking about precursors to comics. Again, what we consider precursors to comics is going to very much depend on how we define comics and what we consider comics to be. We'll talk about this a little more in depth in a couple of weeks when we look at Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, the first chapter. And we've already kind of brought it up a little in last week's video on comics and what they are. But just keep in mind, definitions on this differ. What we consider precursors to comics may also differ in the same way. But based on some of the more common ones, here are some things that a lot of people would agree are precursors to comics, at least in the sense that they're using sequential image-based storytelling. So one of the pretty big precursors that we can kind of think about is the Bayou Tapestry. It comes from around circa 1070. It is an embroidered tapestry. If you've ever been to Bayou or seen pictures of it, it is hugely long. Like it goes around like 4 walls of a room. And it was commissioned after the French Normans conquered England in the year 1066. And the conqueror, William the Conqueror, hence his name, his wife, Matilda, the queen, had this tapestry made to commemorate their victory over the native, or at that time native Anglo-Saxons. They weren't actually native. They had come in and conquered, a few hundred years before. But at that point, they were the folks being colonized, so to speak. And again, we see it as a precursor of comics because, again, it is telling a story by having these images in sequence. It even has some little version you could see of like captions or word balloons, in the sense that we have these words. Like in the sample here, we have the words Harold Rex, Interfectus Est. Harold Rex is King Harold, the Anglo-Saxon King of England. And I believe this is the panel where he gets shot in the face with an arrow, maybe? I would have to look at it. My Latin is very rusty. But it tells the story of the events that led up to the conquest and then the actual conquest itself. So we see things going back even this far. You can go back further. One of the things that McLeod will talk about when we get there is things like even Egyptian tomb paintings. But this, I think we can definitely see some of the roots of what would later become comics here. Moving forward about 700 years, here is A Rake's Progress from 1735. It is a series of engravings made by William Hogarth, who was a sort of famous artist, cartoonist, and he did a lot of these sort of sequential storytellings, which basically have a series of engravings showing a progression of events. In this case, it shows the progression of a rake, which is, a kind of scandalous, pleasure-seeking, no good, bad boy. And it's all about, he lives this privileged existence, and he has wealthy parents and such, and he does not live a responsible life. He goes around, like to brothels, and he sleeps with prostitutes, and he, engages in all sorts of vices, like, drink and drugs and such. And as, he goes on along this, he loses his money, he loses the people who he had considered friends when, he can no longer pay for their drinks and such. He, I think, ends up, like, with diseases, sexual transmitted diseases, and, he ends up dying alone and in poverty, and, a very, very sad life. This is kind of the way things were in the 18th century. They loved their morality tales. And what better tale than a guy who does all the wrong things and, dies destitute and alone as an object lesson to you to not do the same things. So definitely not subtle, but it is very much using some of those techniques that we'll later see in comics. Our next example is a little later, but less than a century. Here we're starting to see political cartoons really come in. And in this case, we have the political cartoon about some a real-life true crime incident called the London Monster, who was a sort of precursor to Jack the Ripper, kind of, coming about a century before, but it was a little less murdery. And basically it was a man who went around, rather than, killing prostitutes, he was finding women, and ideally, the more beautiful and younger and wealthier, the better, and stabbing them in the buttocks. And so this is a political cartoon commenting on the era of the London Monster and its insanity, by showing a woman who has worn a porridge pot over her butt to prevent the monster from being able to stab it under her, big skirts. And but as we can see, we even have, like political cartoons would frequently have captions. We'll be seeing some in a bit with actual word balloons. And so we're seeing these moving closer and closer to what we might consider modern day newspaper comics or comic books. So that modern comics form. If you want to read more about London Monster, it's kind of great. If you're on campus, I do have a book on it that you're welcome to read. But you can also pick up the book. It's called The London Monster online. It's a really entertaining read if you're interested in like history and like weird true crime stories. Then we have in 1836 the Pickwick Papers, Charles Dickens' first novel that hits it big. And it has these famous illustrations by a famous illustrator called Fizz. That was his pseudonym. And Fizz's illustrations were so popular that they basically kind of became synonymous with Dickens's work and for much of his career. And especially a lot of his big novels, the Fizz illustrations are the kind of iconic, definitive ones. Illustrated novels become a huge thing in the 19th century. And like, even when you think about some of those novels that do survive to today, things like Alice in Wonderland, we have these very iconic images that we associate with them. And this could be a case of the Pickwick Papers. Like a lot of your big 19th century novels, it was published serially. It was published in, like, you have a chapter come out every month or couple of weeks, much like a comic book. And much like modern serial storytelling, like comics or, TV shows, it utilized a lot of those same plot devices, things like cliffhangers to keep you coming back for the next installment. And again, we're seeing things moving closer and closer to a comic book. Is we have storytelling that also has these images that are tied to the story that are coming out in these, monthly or bi-weekly or weekly installments. So, here's things we can consider precursors to comics. Then we have things that we would maybe consider early comics, or I won't say maybe, we'll definitely consider these early comics. So what is generally considered the first actual proper comic is a French, a story that's published in French. The creator of it, Rodolphe Töpfer, is a Swiss school teacher and caricaturist who did these illustrated books as a side project to amuse his friends. And those friends include some very famous people. One you may have heard of is Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who is famous for writing the book, The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, based on, I think, the Christopher Marlowe play, but it became kind of well known. He also wrote this sort of classic, the original emo kid classic, which was The Sorrows of Young Werther. And this friend, Goethe, actually was among those of Töpfer who encouraged him to publish these comics. And so this is the one that most people will probably agree is the actual first proper actual comic. And certainly there's a pretty much a consensus that the American translation of this is the first American comic. And so the French title of this, that it was really published by this Swiss author, is L'Histoire de Monsieur Vaubois. So the story of Mr. It's like Oldwood, I think. And this was translated into English as The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck. It's released in 1837 originally, and in the U.S. in 1842. As you can kind of see, there is this, it's sequential storytelling. The storytelling is told mostly through captions. I don't think we really have word balloons at this point. But we have these series of images, each of which is accompanied by these little text captions that tell the story of Obadiah Oldbuck. Interestingly, I will put this up on Blackboard for you to look at if you're curious and would like to check it out. It's kind of a little disturbing by modern standards because it is it's really kind of depressing and kind of a messed up story in that it is a comedy, but it's playing things like, the main character constantly losing out on the one he loves to other guys, and so he's trying to commit suicide, but he's so terrible at it that he fucks that up too. It's really kind of disturbing to read at times for reasons like that, where the way we think about these things has very much changed since the mid-1800s. But definitely it's worth reading as this sort of, historical document for the history of comics. The first true American, homegrown American comic comes a little later in 1849, and that is called Journey to the Gold Diggins by Jeremiah Saddlebags. And it's written by James and Donald Reed, who I believe are brothers. They were almost certainly familiar with Rudolf Topfer and his work, and certainly they are very much creating their own story in that same vein. Jeremiah Saddlebags it's again this kind of comedic story told using sequential images, each of which has a caption. It's again this story about this kind of comical misfortune. And this one is also available on Blackboard. So if you want to check out either of these like kind of historic documents, they're optional. You don't have to read them. But if you want to, they're there. So that then kind of, we're continuing along in that sort of general vein. The next big sort of move forward in comics history comes as we're nearing the 20th century. In the 1890s, since I think it starts in 1895, Richard F. Outcault creates a character called the Yellow Kid. And the Yellow Kid, as you can see in this image, is a kid that is yellow. And it actually comes out of the comics Hogan's Alley, which was published well into the 20th century. And the Yellow Kid was a sort of hit character, and he was well known for having his dialogue, the things that he said on his chest, like on his shirt smock thing. But it eventually popularized the use of word balloons. You can kind of see that in here. We have the word balloons coming out of the phonograph, and then also eventually coming out of the Yellow Kid himself and even the little bird at the end. So we do have the Yellow Kid comics as this sort of real big step forward, in that it's one of the first big newspaper comics, and one of the first Sunday comics which really uses color. And it really popularizes the use of word balloons, and it did in fact give its name to an entire genre of journalism. Have you ever heard of yellow journalism, which tends to be used for trashy tabloid, reporting that's all about sensationalism and not necessarily about accuracy? Yellow journalism was originally Yellow Kid journalism, and it was referring to papers that published the Yellow Kid comics, because they were seen as a little more sensational and greedy for getting people to buy them, so doing whatever they had to do that. So not just part of comics history, but also part of just general newspaper and journalism history. Once again, in the 20th century, we start seeing people really experimenting with comics and bring them to something we might recognize as modern comics. One of the ones who really kind of leads this sort of effort is Windsor Mckay, who does, he's most famous probably for his comic Little Nemo and Slumberland. And this is the early 20th century. This is, I think Little Nemo starts in 1905. So again, it is a newspaper comic, and Mckay does a lot of experimentation with the form of the comics page, the use of color, the way he does timing and pacing and using sequence to tell a story, varying the size and shape of panels, doing some interesting things with perspective and architecture and level of detail. It's very much Art Nouveau in style, which was kind of very much the traditional artistic style of the time. That was the kind of the fad, the popular style. But as a result of doing all of this experimentation with the comics form, he pioneers a lot of devices that are now pretty common in comics and are fairly influential. And as you can kind of see from the image, this is clearly like a modern comic in ways that the stuff we've looked at previously is not. We have our standard panels, we have our use of color, we have, our word balloons, we have, some sequential storytelling showing us action in the sense of we see him sliding down the chimney, or sliding down the roof even as Santa and his reindeer start sliding across the roof. So here we're actually seeing what we would probably consider, oh, this is definitely a comic. Some of these earlier ones we might have been a bit iffy on. And again, Little Nemo, really popular and successful, and was well known enough, even into when I was a kid, they made a video game of Little Nemo and Slumberland based on like a Japanese cartoon, because that was not just influential in the U.S. but also in Japan, and a lot of these, some of the really early popular American comics artists, including both folks like Windsor Mckay and stuff like the Disney comics that we'll talk about later, are very much influential on things like manga in Japan. So, we've kind of had this steady evolution of the comics form into something we would recognize as modern comics. When we tend to talk about comics in America, we divide it into eras, as I already mentioned. The first of those eras is the Golden Age, which people disagree on when it ends, but everyone agrees on when it begins. And that is something that everyone is universally agreed upon. And the Golden Age of comics begins in April 1938. Usually it ends around 1950, but some folks say later, some folks say earlier. But 1938, we see the publication of Action Comics #1, which features in it a story by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster that introduces a superhero, the first real superhero. We'd had kind of pulp heroes before that, folks like the Phantom and the Shadow and Doc Savage, and this is very much building on one particular strand of those pulp heroes, the kind of science fantasy hero who, has these kind of cool, like, gadgets, and, like, there's, some kind of form of science that has somehow made him, like, greater than normal men. In this particular case, this character is an alien sent away from a dying planet to Earth, where he eventually dresses up in the traditional kind of clothing of a circus strongman of the time, a kind of bodysuit and trunks, and goes around, fighting crime and saving the day. He is, of course, Superman, who is the first superhero, as we would think of superheroes nowadays. And so this is the first superhero comic really created, and it hits it huge. This is pretty universally seen as the beginning of the Golden Age, and it is done so because this is the beginning of the superhero boom. So, Action Comics #1, famous comic, and we'll talk about, again, we'll go into superhero comics in more detail later, and talk about all these in more depth, and we will in fact read that initial Superman story. In addition, we'll also be reading what came out the next year and was as influential, if not more so, Detective Comics #27, which had a story in it by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, introducing a superhero based on the other kind of pulp hero, the like two-fisted detective, or one of the other types, the other big type. And that is, of course, Batman. And both of these hit it big, create this huge superhero boom. The comics company that creates these comics, like, they hit it so big with Batman, especially even more than Superman, that they named their company after their most popular comic, Detective Comics. Hence, we now call them DC Comics. And those pulp fiction heroes came out of, like, pulp novels, pulp radio shows, and so a lot of those kinds of characters that were popular in the early 20th century become the basis for these comics characters that still exist today, although in somewhat changed form. So certainly DC Comics gets bigger and bigger. Over the next few years it introduces Robin and Wonder Woman and all these famous characters. And then we hit Wartime Comics, because obviously, 1938, World War II starts, although America is not in it yet. But in 1941, before America enters the war, over to a rival comics company, Timely Comics, creators Joe Simon and Jack Kirby create a character called Captain America. And this was, in fact, in 1941, this was like, I think, several months before Pearl Harbor. Now, I know you know kind of the history of World War II, but pre-Pearl Harbor, a lot of Americans were not super keen on entering World War II. There was this idea that it was this thing that was over in Europe, and it was their problem, and it's not our problem. And obviously, it would eventually become our problem, and it eventually did. But even as late as not too long, within a year before Pearl Harbor, you had Nazi rallies in Madison Square Garden that were hugely well attended. There were a lot of kind of racist anti-Semitic people in the U.S. in the 30s and 40s, and they were they did not hate the Nazi platform. Obviously, once Japan bombs Pearl Harbor in alliance with the Nazis, then the American tone kind of changes. But one thing to keep in mind with a lot of these early comics is that, especially superhero comics, almost all of the creators are Jewish. So they had a little more kind of at stake than a lot of Americans did as far as World War II went. Because although the true horrors of the Holocaust had not yet come out, they were definitely, they knew shit was going down. And so Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who create Superman, I believe either Bob Kane or Bill Finger, if not both, who create Batman, and then obviously Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who create Captain America, all Jewish. And actually, when this comic was published, there were a lot of Nazis were not happy that it showed Captain America on the cover of this newly published comic punching a foreign head of state, because that's what Hitler was considered at the time by a lot of Americans. Not, what we now consider Hitler as possibly one of the most horrible people in existence. It was they were you had some Nazis who were not super happy, and Nazi sympathizers. And so they, came down to Timely Comics headquarters and, wanted to meet Joe Simon and Jack Kirby to, beat the shit out of them. Jack Kirby, who grew up on kind of the hardscrabble streets of New York at the time, he was quite happy to go down and face them, and he actually did. But by that time, they had skedaddled. Apparently, they were not really out for an actual physical confrontation. So you actually see in these early days, even something as we generally tend not to think of early superhero comics as making political statements, but they definitely did. Which is part of why you'll sometimes hear people nowadays talk about how to understand why we have to have politics in our comics. And to that I'd say, watch Captain America punch a foreign head of state on the cover of Captain America Comics #1 and tell me that's not political. So obviously, once America does enter the war post-Pearl Harbor, Captain America becomes even bigger. All of the other superheroes end up getting drafted into the wartime effort in the comics. And so, there's a lot of really sort of interesting, but also, in retrospect, very questionable comics. Very, very, comics that are really dehumanizing of Japanese people, especially. But, and it becomes this kind of huge thing. After the war, for the record, if you're wondering whatever happened to Timely Comics, which created Captain America, they, of course, eventually become Marvel Comics, who also is the now owner of Captain America, and who are probably best known now for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The same company in its various forms still exists today, as with DC. After the war, superheroes end up actually declining some in popularity, while several other genres kind of burst forth into bloom and increase in popularity to replace them. So although superheroes are kind of out of vogue through a good chunk of the 40s, they're not without, folks were not without comics to read. They just were not reading as much with the superheroes that have been so big for so many years before. One of the new genres that hits it big is teen comics. And here you can see Archie Comics #1 from 1942. Obviously, Archie Comics are still being published. Their most recent adaptation, Riverdale, is like a CW show that seems to be fairly popular, albeit very different from some of the original Archie comics. And teen comics definitely become a big thing, in the sense that like teen culture in general really becomes big in the 40s and 50s in a way that it had kind of not necessarily been seen as this sort of separate stage of life before. After World War II, we really start seeing teenagerdom and teenagerhood as like an identity in ways that before it had just been there were kids and then there were adults. Another sort of big thing that hits it big is Disney comics. Specifically, these are obviously coming out of Walt Disney and using the characters that they've already, pioneered, your Mickey Mouses and your Donald Ducks and your Scrooge McDucks and all that. These comics are hugely successful. And they were successful well into the, for many years here in America. Outside of America, they continue to be hugely mega successful in ways they weren't. And even people like my age and younger in, say, like Germany, like you can get like hardcover fancy multi-$100 editions of, Scrooge McDuck comics in Germany because they are that beloved and they were that popular even into like the 80s and 90s, and I would be surprised even today. So these hit it huge worldwide. They do eventually fall off in popularity after, a while in the US. They don't necessarily elsewhere in the world, or it takes much, much longer. Other sort of genres that kind of hit it big in this era include romance comics. There's some really interesting stuff going on with these romance comics, often aimed at teenagers, and a lot of drama and cheating and a lot of incidental sexism. I have a big book about romance comics that is in our humanities library when we get that back up and running after our remodel. So for those of you who are on campus, if you ever like to check that out, it actually reprints several full stories from these romance comics. The one that I remember most memorably is one in which a newlywed young woman, she goes out to have lunch with her female friends instead of changing the light bulb in her basement stairs. As a result, her husband falls down the stairs, is wounded, and as she, is with him in, the hospital, she tearfully, confesses that really, now she realizes that what she really needs to be spending her time on is her man and her life as a housewife. She shouldn't be spending all this time out with her friends. No, she should be only devoting her time to her husband. And she should not be letting things like replacing light bulbs slip, because otherwise she could be imperiling her husband and, even worse, her marriage. So that's the sort of thing that you'll sometimes see in these romance comics. Really interesting is a certain era. Definitely some very different attitudes towards men and women and heterosexual relationships than we would probably be super comfortable with now. We have Western comics. Here we have Black Rider, which features a sort of Zorro, Lone Ranger type of, Western hero. Again, a lot of these are coming out of the pulp fiction genres, just like the superheroes did back in the day. So certainly, you did have some pulp stories that featured that same kind of, Western theme. Think of like the Lone Ranger, which started out, as radio. And then we also have, in addition to our Western comics, crime and horror comics. So here's crime suspense stories, which is a little iffy for, the 1950, as you might expect, given that, it's showing a woman's severed head on the cover. And kind of going along with it, you have horror comics. Again, 1950, Tales from the Crypt, which showing like shambling, rotting corpses and things like that. So again, some of these, especially the crime ones, are taking some of their cues from the pulp heroes, pulp fiction, but they're also kind of pushing things to a new level, going full on like gore and really like kind of doing things that we might find kind of questionable nowadays. And we are not the only ones. That then brings us to our sort of, if we have a period in between the Golden Age and the Silver Age, that would be a period of moral panic. And it depends on where you really put the Golden Age ending. But we definitely have, through much of the 50s, a sort of moral panic over comics. An idea that comics are warping your children's minds and making them like, horrible criminals and turning them homosexual and like a lot of other things that 50s people were very afraid of their children being. And really, you can kind of see where some of the concern over the Conan is coming in the sense of like, some of those comics, those horror and crime comics, can be kind of graphic. Maybe not so much to folks who, have seen, Deadpool and Game of Thrones and lots of R-rated movies in, the 2000s. But certainly for the 1950s, this was a concern to people, especially since something very similar had happened with movies several decades before, which put into kind of place the Hays Code of films, which there were certain things that films could and couldn't show, certain things films could and couldn't endorse, and it was a very mixed bag by modern standards of things you could and couldn't show. So like, it prevented you from showing graphic violence, it prevented you from showing like any kind of graphic sex, or even like really super heavily implied sex. This is why, in the 50s all those movies have couples in double beds, and TV shows. But it also did things like, for example, saying you could not depict homosexuality, because that was also frowned on. It also meant you could not have any stories where the bad guys win, because those were not moral stories. So, some things we might maybe understand, at least being limited being shown. Some other things that by my standards would be like, oh, that's really questionable. Same with comics. And the moral panic is kicked off, really to its peak, by the release of a book in 1954 called Seduction of the Innocent, by Frederick Wertham, M.D. You can see the headline of the cover of the book has its sort of tagline, "The Influence of Comic Books on Today's Youth." Spoiler alert, that influence, he says, is not good. Wertham, in his book, argues that comic books are unhealthy, they create juvenile delinquency. He says that violence, sex, drug use, and these things in comics teach kids to do the same. Among some of his other accusations of comics, he claimed that they promoted children to becoming perverts because clearly Batman and Robin were an idealized gay relationship. Clearly Wonder Woman is all about bondage, which, to be fair, that one actually is pretty justified. Wonder Woman's creator had some very specific fetishes and was quite happy to put those into his comics. But he also said that Wonder Woman was clearly seducing our daughters into lesbianism because she was a strong and independent woman. He said Superman was an un-American fascist, and this book hit it big. Again, we'll talk about this in much more detail when we actually read some selections from Seduction of the Innocent. But it led to Wertham testifying before a Senate panel on comics. And the Senate panel comes to the conclusion that comics basically need to be limited, need to be, censored to some extent, whether that's self-censored or externally. And on the recommendation of this panel, comics publishers got together and created the Comics Code Authority, which would basically approve comics being published or not. And if they were not Comics Code approved, it'd be very difficult for them to get into, comic stores and such. This Comics Code takes place and starts in the 50s. It is officially in place until 2011. So just over a decade ago, it finally ended. And the Comics Code was very much like the Hays Code for films. Limited what kind of violence you could show, limited what kind of sex you could show, and imply for both of those. It very much limited what you could show on homosexuality, and basically said you couldn't show gay people, and if you did, they had to be evil, as with films. You couldn't have bad guys win. You couldn't show drugs. There were a lot of limits that it placed on comics. And some of those, things kind of started, comics started to kind of come out of it in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and by the last decade or so, it was pretty toothless. But definitely, it was a long era of comics. And there were a lot of things that it very much limited you to be able to show in comics for a long time. In retrospect, we look at Seduction of the Innocent now. Pretty much all of its allegations, aside from things like, the 101 BDSM thing, are completely unwarranted. There's no evidence to support any of them. He cited a lot of science and studies that he had done that he claimed were evidence as, these comics would turn your children into, juvenile delinquents and homosexuals and such. In retrospect, we've now actually gained access to those science and studies when his papers came out, I think, in the 90s. And, shocker, all of that science was terribly done. At best, poorly reported. At worst, straight out fraudulently reported and lied about. And it was specifically written with the aim of stirring up this moral panic to make a name for Wortham. You may see some similarities to some of the more recent moral panics on things like video games. And again, with movies, with video games, with comics, it's all pretty much been the same story. Moral critics are like, these things are evil and they will warp our children's minds. And then there's a heavy crackdown. And then once, cultural values move on, people are like, actually, in retrospect, that was bullshit. So I think we can probably expect that video games will be the same. But for now, certainly, for both the Hays Code for films and the Comics Code for comics, both of those were established on, fear-mongering that was just based on utter grade A bullshit. So, the more you know. So as a result of this moral panic and the Comics Code coming in, horror and crime comics completely fall out of style. Because part of the reason we were reading those was for, the kind of graphic, grossness and, terror and suspense. It's a lot harder to do that if you, are very limited in what violence and sex you can show. The big company for both of those, EC Comics, then ended up focusing on Mad Magazine, their sort of parody magazine for many years after this, and just gave up on comics and pretty much entirely aside from that. A lot of that more friendly stuff, like the Disney comics or Archie, ends up coming in to kind of fill that gap for the rest of the period before the Silver Age starts, whether we call that part of the Golden Age or something in between. And yeah, the Comic Code Authority, put in place in 1954, ends in 2011. And you can always tell a Comics Code stamp, or Comics Code comic, because it has this Comics Code Authority stamp on it. There are two dates that pretty much everyone agrees on. The first date that everyone agrees on is the beginning of the Golden Age, 1938, with Action Comics #1 and the introduction of Superman. The second date that everyone agrees on is 1956 for the beginning of the Silver Age. And that is because in 1956, we have the first superhero introduced after that big superhero crash post-war. And that is the second The Flash, in Showcase #4 from 1956. And, again, a lot of superheroes have been introduced. They'd got fallen out of favor. At this point, they're coming back into favor enough that new superheroes are actually being created. And in this case, we have the creation of the Flash that if any of you watch the Flash TV show or the Justice League movie, this is the Flash that we tend to think of as the Flash, which is Barry Allen, who was the first, the Silver Age Flash. There was a Flash back in the Golden Age, but he was a different character who was much less popular. And with the Flash, we start to see a resurgence of superhero comics and this kind of comeback. Because of the Comics Code, there's definitely a change in tone. Some of those early Superman and Batman comics, especially even those ones that we read when we read the first ones of both of those, we'll notice that there's certain things even in those comics that that the Comics Code Authority would not necessarily have allowed. Like the first Superman comic, you have like Superman going after an evil government lobbyist who's working with a Banana Republic. You have Superman going after a wife beater, and these are sort of things that might have been a bit more questionable to depict under the Comics Code Authority. And so as a result, superhero comics in the Silver Age tend to be a lot more, have a strain of campy and silly humor that they really hadn't necessarily had a ton of before. So a great example here is Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen from 1958, which features, it centers on Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, and it features in this story the son of Superman. We have a cover where Jimmy is getting his new dad, Superman, a Father's Day present, and Superman is saying that he's sorry that he ever adopted Jimmy as his son, and he'll destroy the present to teach Jimmy a lesson. And Superman and Jimmy, of course, is like, what did I do wrong? There were a lot of stories with this kind of setup. Usually in the Silver Age, especially Superman is really kind of bad about this. A lot of, to the point where there's actually a website set up out there called Super Dickery, which is all about Superman being a huge dick to his friends and family on the cover of Superman comics. Usually it's some kind of big fake out where it makes him seem like he's just being this utter asshole. And then in the comic there's actually a reason. I think in the reality for this comic, the bathrobe had kryptonite hidden in it or something that Jimmy didn't know about. So it's all usually misleading. But there's definitely this kind of campy, silly humor in a lot of Silver Age comics. And this is also the Silver Age comics on the Batman side of things are what give rise to the Batman TV series, which has that same kind of strain of campy and silly humor. And we'll talk about that later in the semester, and I think I usually show some clips from it, so we'll have that as well. But so we have the Silver Age. It has this kind of campy, silly humor for a lot of it. Not all of it, but definitely it is a thing in ways that it maybe was not in the Golden Age. That said, it does also introduce a certain level of maturity to comics, I think, in the sense that we start to see comics emphasizing superheroes, not just their superhero-ness, but also their personness, their humanness. Not that there hadn't always been some of that with characters like Batman, but we do see more of that emerging, in part because the Comics Code Authority is limiting a lot of what you can do with your characters to make your story appealing. But one thing it's not necessarily limiting a ton of is a lot of your characterization. You can still do that. And so, just as the Golden Age gives rise to a lot of the great classic DC heroes, this is where you get your Superman, your Batman, your Wonder Woman, your Robin, most of your Batman villains, or a lot of the classic ones. You have a lot of these really iconic DC Comics characters come out of the Golden Age. You have some Silver Age ones too, like the second Flash, the second Green Lantern, but we tend to associate the Golden Age primarily with those DC characters because they're the ones that kick it off. The Silver Age, interestingly, is sort of a period that sees the rise of Marvel Comics, DC Comics' biggest competitor, and the introduction of a lot of their classic heroes. So we have, in 1961, Marvel really has their first huge hit outside of Captain America, and their first big post-war hit, in the introduction of the Fantastic Four by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Then 1963, we have the introduction, or 1962, sorry, we have the introduction of Spider-Man. 1963, we have the introduction of the X-Men. In 1963, we also have the introduction of the Avengers. So, one of the things that is really interesting about Marvel and DC, we'll talk more about this more with focus on superhero comics, is the idea that the emphasis on the humanity of the heroes. DC had always done that with some, with like stuff like Batman and his dead parents. But Marvel always gave us like Peter Parker as like this kind of sad sack journalist, or like before that a kind of sad sack high school student. There was much more emphasis on like their everyday lives and the problems that being a person in a modern society would create. Like the Fantastic Four as a team were constantly bickering in ways that your other superhero teams had not done as often, because the Fantastic Four were a family, and that's what families do. So, in a lot of ways, the archetypal Silver Age hero is Spider-Man. Even though he is a superhero, he has a pretty sucky life outside of that. He can't make rent. He's frequently, romantically unlucky, at least early on. He's, kind of this bullied loser in a lot of ways. And there's emphasis on him, more on Peter Parker, than on him as Spider-Man. Some argue that there's more emphasis in the Silver Age on science and sci-fi and aliens, and less focus on magic, mysticism, and gods. Your minds may vary on that, and it's kind of debatable. Some folks will agree on that, some people won't. One other thing we see in the Silver Age is the emergence of underground comics. Here we have Zap Comics by R. Crumb, who is one of the most famous underground comics creators of the 20th century. Not that there hadn't always been underground comics of some sort or other. Back, in the early 20th century and like early war and during war and immediately post-war, you had things like Tijuana Bibles, which were like little porn comics, clearly unofficial. So there'd always been these sort of unofficial, unlicensed, underground comics. With the advent of the Comics Code, you start to see that there is a backlash against the Comics Code. The people are like, I want to write about, sex and violence and, like gayness and all these things that they say we can't write about. So it's actually being used as an artistic choice rather than just a necessity. Because, you're doing a porn comic of Mickey Mouse. But also, it starts to become a kind of community because there are a lot of people who want to do this. And see the Comics Code as kind of overly limiting. The important thing about these underground comics is that because they did not have to follow the Comics Code, they could have sex and violence and all those things. They did not have to, but they could, and so they were often adults only. And you can see on the cover of the Zap comic, it doesn't, I don't think the image is quite big enough to see it super clearly, but or maybe it is, no it is. As you can see, it's they have a kind of fake Comics Code seal that has that same sort of stamp look, but it is also it's clearly not actually the Comics Code seal. It's kind of a parody of it. So, Silver Age introduces these new heroes. We see superheroes make this kind of revival and resurgence. And we also see the introduction of these underground comics emerging. So people will disagree on where the Silver Age actually ends. Some put it as early as 1970, with Jack Kirby leaving for DC Comics. Some put it as late as 1973, with the death of Spider-Man's girlfriend Gwen Stacy, which is the kind of big watershed moment for comics. But for now, for these purposes, let's go with that first period of 1970. And let's say that's where our Silver Age ends and our Bronze Age begins. But keep in mind that aside from the 1938 and 1956 time periods, like those dates, everyone else disagrees on all the other dates as far as beginnings and endings of ages and such. So, Bronze Age, for these purposes, we'll say 1970, but 1973, really anywhere in there is fine. This only gets seen as kind of a darker and edgier time period. And we start to see the first kind of cracks in the Comics Code Authority. We see authors that after, a decade and a half of having to write stories that really skirt around a lot of these, real life things like violence and sex and gay people and like drug habits and like these are things that are in life and they were not allowed to show them in comics. And so you have, as a result, you have authors start to chafe under some of these restrictions and start to kind of push things. So one thing you tend to have creators and stories that focus more on social ills. We're now post-civil rights movement, and we're well into the women's movement, near the gay rights movement. People are starting to think about things like, racism and prejudice. So a lot of authors want to deal with these things that the Comics Code doesn't let them do. They want to talk about some level of sex, because, especially a lot of our superheroes that might have started as teens, like Spider-Man and the X-Men, well, they're now in their 20s. They're in relationships. Like, can't have them sleep in twin beds forever. There's, they want to talk about drugs. Like, we're past the, freewheeling hippie 60s, and we're into the 70s. Again, drugs are a thing. Drug habits are a thing. And, drug addictions are a thing. And it's the sort of thing that comics people wanted to explore. We're also interestingly moving into the era of, exploitation films, where movies are really getting in on that. Let's, screw the Hays Code. Let's do, blaxploitation and, films about women's prisons that are all, sexy lesbians and things like that. And so there's an urge, as we're seeing that in popular culture, to do something similar in comics. So there's a lot of starting to push the edges of the Comics Code Authority. And as well, TNA are selling on the big screen, let's put them in our comics as well. What's interesting about this period is we start to see more superheroes of color. The 70s really introduced, a lot of the big kind of black superheroes. This is where you get, your Falcons and your Black Panthers and your, Storms and Luke Cages. All of these are characters that are coming out of, the Bronze Age for the most part, the early parts of the Bronze Age. You also have, other non-white superheroes really emerging in this era. You have your, Asian superheroes, like Shang-Chi, I think, comes out of this era. You have, I'm trying to think, you have Latino heroes coming out of this era. You have your native superheroes coming out in this era. We'll talk about X-Men in a bit. They do a lot of the introduction of, the non-white superheroes, but definitely, even outside of that, these characters are still being introduced. So more superheroes of color, and again, a lot of sort of pushing at some of these boundaries of the Comics Code. So Conan Comics kind of are one of the great mainstays of the 70s. We see this kind of swords and sorcery, heroic fantasy. It's kind of a big thing in pop culture, and it's one in comics as well. Again, talking about, your TNA, Conan does a lot of that, and similar kinds of stories. We have, and Conan is in fact brought into Marvel Comics. He is officially a Marvel Comics character. He has crossovers in Marvel. Things that you might not necessarily expect, given that is not how he started out. Here we have the infamous Green Lantern issue, which features a Green Lantern and Green Arrow at this point. And it features Green Arrow discovering that his ward, Speedy, is addicted to heroin. Speedy, Roy Harper, for any of you who are maybe familiar with like the Arrow TV show, it is that character, who eventually becomes like Red Arrow and Arsenal and those. So in the 70s, we have a couple of stories that are pretty close to one another. This and then a Marvel story about the Green Goblin. Both of these stories actually violate the comics code in that they have characters with drug habits explicitly having those drug habits. And for both of these comics, this is seen as an issue with the comics code. I think the first one is the Green Goblin drug story. And I believe with that one, they actually just straight up decided to publish that issue without the comics code stamp of approval anyway. Of course, given that every other Marvel comic has that seal, obviously that one's going to get sold by the comic stores regardless of whether it has the seal or not. And I think it's at this point both comics and the comics code realize that this is kind of toothless. It only has as much power as we let it. Like, if folks want to read the new Spider-Man story and it doesn't have the comics code approval, they're going to read it anyway. They're going to find it. And so as a result, the Comics Code Authority does in fact revise their code for, I believe, the first of several times to make it okay to write about drugs as long as it's about how they're bad. So as long as there's a lesson moral of like drugs are bad. And although I think the Green Lantern story was being created when this was still against the Comics Code Authority, by the time it actually got published, they had made that change. And so that's why it does get the approved seal. But these are both kind of famous stories and kind of shows the comic industry like, hey, we can actually, we can push at this. Especially if we're not doing it gratuitously the way they were with those 50s horror comics. If we're doing it to actually tell stories and develop characters and things, we can push some of these limits. And then, kind of as we're kind of going to a slightly darker and edgier place, like Bronze Age is still, it's not some of the campy fun that the Silver Age sometimes get into, but we're still not too super dark. We get, in 1973, the infamous storyline where Spider-Man's girlfriend, Gwen Stacy, dies in Amazing Spider-Man number 121 in 1973. And here we have the famous panels, which feature the Green Goblin throwing Gwen Stacy off a bridge, Spider-Man trying to save her, catching her with his web. Unfortunately, he was not taking into account the fact that she is falling very fast, and catching her by her foot ends up snapping her neck. And so she's dead by the end. This was a pretty huge thing, because she was a major character in Spider-Man. She was his love interest, and they straight up killed her. And this was not something that had really ever been done before, and certainly not with someone this major. So yeah, this was kind of a huge watershed change in superhero comics at the very least, because and additionally it's not without its controversy. Quite a few of the subsequent publications of this story cut out the little you can see here we have this little sound effect on Gwen Stacy's neck as she's caught that gives a little snap sound, clearly showing that it is him catching her and that snaps her neck. Apparently there were some issues with the idea that Spider-Man even intentionally might have killed his girlfriend, and so there were multiple later publications of this that removed that sound effect entirely. And I was like, oh, she must have just somehow died on the way down from terror or something. So even something like this, still, it's kind of, if it's not doing anything directly against the Comics Code Authority, it is definitely still a little controversial at the time. But hugely successful, hugely big, and really kind of gets both Marvel and DC to realize that, hey, we can do some really interesting things with our comics. Especially since we can, we can kill people and have permanent consequences in ways that we couldn't before. So, another big kind of creation of the Bronze Age is giant-sized X-Men #1. So we saw with the Silver Age introduction of the original 5 X-Men, all white, one woman, like all very clearly like white Christian Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It's a group of wasps. Giant-sized X-Men #1 gives us a very different crew of X-Men. We have a black woman. We have a German guy who looks like a demon. We have a native superhero who unfortunately dies like 2 issues later. Go figure. But certainly it is. Hey, we'll look at Giant-sized X-Men and talk about that in a little more detail. But yeah, just it's not great. We have a Russian character on the team, which is, this is at the height of the Cold War. We have Wolverine from Canada, and we have Banshee from Ireland. He's not on the cover, of course. And Sunfire from Japan, because they don't end up staying on the team. But so we have more female X-Men. We have X-Men of color. And so it says something about the way comics have changed, that the original X-Men are like 5 white American kids with 1 girl. And in this new group, we have folks from a lot of different countries. We have people of color. And it's a much more interesting and diverse group of people. Again, with that kind of drug arc and the change in the Comics Code authorities that came out of it, they realized that they could do more with this. So in 1979, we have the famous Demon in a Bottle arc of Iron Man, which features Tony Stark as Iron Man coming to terms with his alcoholism and, having to kind of deal with it and get it treated. Again, not the sort of thing you'd have seen earlier under the Comics Code, but this is now the sort of thing that they can do, and it actually, worked out very well for characterization and making Iron Man a more interesting character. We also, outside the world of superhero comics, start seeing some of those independent comics really hit kind of big outside of those big superhero publishers. So we have the first title to popularize the name graphic novel in 1978 with A Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories by Will Eisner. We'll read the title story from this comic. But Eisner was a big name of 20th century comics. He'd done superhero comics with things like The Spirit back in the day. Then he became later best known for doing autobiographical comics. They did involve sex and violence. And because they were published as a book rather than as individual comics issues, there was no need for them to be approved by the Comics Code Authority. And so, A Contract with God, there's sex, there's violence, there's things that the Comics Code would not approve, but this is independent, it's published as a book, it does not have to worry about those things. And as a result, this kind of creates a wave of other underground comics coming out in the same way. A few years later, in 1980, Art Spiegelman releases the first part of Mouse, which is his Contract with God was Eisner's own sort of semi-autobiographical story, which was it was based on his past and folks he knew, but it was still technically fictional. Mouse is also semi-autobiographical in that it is not about Art Spiegelman, although he does appear as a character in it. It is telling the story of his grandfather, who is a Holocaust survivor. Wasn't. He's since died, I'm sure. So this is another memoir comic about the Holocaust. And about his grandfather's memories and experiences, and about his coming to terms with his grandfather's experiences and memories. And Mouse is one of the first kind of comics to really hit it big in the mainstream as like an actual respected piece of art. People are like, hey, this is not like, a superhero comic that's all, spandex and punching. Like, this is telling a really interesting, sensitively told emotional story. Comics have been doing that for a while as well in some ways, but as for superhero comics, but certainly this is getting mainstream audiences' attention in a way that X-Men hadn't. And then it's followed quickly by some of the other comics that we'll talk about that we would tend to consider as part of the later age. So these indie comics are kind of coming out, hitting it big, and we're starting to see the idea that comics can be actually respectable as literature. Another big thing that doesn't get a slide in this, but it is a big thing of the Bronze Age, is realizing that comics companies had actually treated a lot of those early superstar writers and creators really, really poorly. The creators of Superman, the creators of Batman, the creators of, like a lot of these classic characters. The comics companies had kind of treated them like shit. Like, there's just no better way to put it. Like, the creators of Superman were kind of... They were not living in great shape. One of the co-creators of Batman was living in poverty. They did not pay them well. They never really did anything to... They didn't necessarily guarantee them future employment. They took the characters that these people had created, made, like, millions and billions of dollars off them, and gave them jack shit. And comics fans, understandably, were not super happy when this started coming out. Like, they didn't love the fact that the people responsible for creating these characters they loved were basically, like, living in, like, tenements eating cat food to survive, or the equivalent. And so there was this kind of outcry that, hey, we should treat these people better. We'll talk about this more in detail when we talk more in depth about superhero comics. But a lot of those creators got screwed over. A lot of them didn't even really get properly credited for the contributions that they did. And obviously they didn't get a ton of money. And one of the things that we did see in this period was some level of at least making sure that those folks got the credit for those creations, even if, and hopefully ideally helping them, some financially as well. So creator crediting issues really kind of started to hit it big in the comics world, and people were like, hey, maybe we should treat, the creators of Superman and Batman and so on better. Underground comics kind of begin to hit it semi-big, and we have these kind of chips away at the Comics Code Authority. Then we end up with the Modern Age, also sometimes called the Dark Age, which is usually called the Modern Age, though. This is 1985 to the present. You may wonder why each of these previous ages tend to be like less than 20 years, and then the Modern Age is like 40. That is in part because that was around the time we started seeing things like comics, history, and criticism and scholarship coming out, and no one's ever really done a properly definitive updating of these eras since then. But it's also because, although there's definite distinctions between, comics in the 2010s and comics in, the 1990s, they're maybe not quite as big as the distinctions between, the 1990s and the 1960s or something. But I think at some point we will see a further subdivision of these 40 years. We just haven't quite gotten there yet. So the Modern Age tends to be characterized early on by this appeal of grim and gritty and dark things. We specifically kind of see things going darker and edgier with two really kind of comics that hit it big in 1986-ish, which is probably why we tend to put the Modern Age as being right before that. And those two comics are Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. And certainly it's still well known in popular culture in the sense that they made a movie of it with Zack Snyder. They did an HBO TV series of it a few years ago. It's been brought into the mainstream DC universe recently. So Watchmen is kind of one of these big kind of grim and gritty and darker and edgier kinds of stories about superheroes. And the same year, we see Frank Miller with Klaus Janson and Lynn Varley create The Dark Knight Returns, which is what we'll be reading this semester, and which is equally, I think, as influential. maybe not so much as its own story, but for the way it influences other sort of Batman and superhero stories. These both kind of go to darker themes. We're really chipping away at the Comics Code Authority. Like The Dark Knight Returns, as with so many Frank Miller pieces, introduces like the idea of like, Catwoman, an aged, washed-up Catwoman is like the runner of a brothel, a whorehouse. And we have, in Watchmen, we have implications of sex. We have implications of, we have a certain level of graphic violence that, might not have been allowed in earlier days of the Comics Code Authority. And both of these authors are, again, pushing the edges, pushing the boundaries. And these are so big that comics really dives into everything has to be darker and edgier and grittier and extreme as we move into the 90s. And 90s comics are best known for an emphasis on comics events. Like, these things will change the world forever. We see the introduction of a new team of X-Men, which is mostly the old team, but it's like this kind of big revamp of X-Men. In 1991, which also happens to coincide with the introduction a year later of a super popular animated series, cartoons, for both X-Men and Batman, that really introduced these comics to an entirely new generation. Certainly as a kid in the 90s, that was how I got into comics, was that I loved the X-Men animated series, and I loved the Batman animated series, and then, I loved the X-Men animated series so much that I actually ended up starting to buy X-Men comics, and that's how I got into it. So, this is kind of this, in a lot of ways, a golden age for comics, and that they're selling in ways they'd never sold before. Like, X-Men #1 is still the best-selling comic of all time. But, in part because of the success of things like that, there was this emphasis on collectible comics, because this is a period where, people are realizing, hey, these 30-year-old comics from the early 60s, the first appearance of X-Men, or even further back, comics from the 30s, the first appearance of Superman, are selling for a shit ton of money. And so, the idea of comics are not this thing you can collect and you can rake it in later became a thing. And so there was this emphasis on comics as collectibles, and foil covers and alternate covers and things like that. There's this emphasis on, comics events, like this X-Men, or, moving to our next slide, the Death of Superman, which, for the record, for those of you who are not around in the 90s, this did come packaged in a black plastic bag with a little black cardboard mourning armband to wear for Superman. And obviously the recommendation at the time was that you buy 2 copies, one to open and read, and then one to keep for collectible purposes. So, as you can see, if everything is an event, then nothing can really stay special. And if everything is collectible, then nothing is collectible. And this does eventually kind of lead to this crash of a collectible bubble, and this almost destroys the comics industry. That said, the first few of these things really did work. Like, when Superman died, it was big news in mainstream media. The first, this is now not super uncommon to have, newspapers report on this, but, at the time, the New York Times was reporting that Superman had died. This was big shit for comics fans. One other thing that the 90s introduces is creator-owned comics. Kind of coming out as a result of all of the screwing over of comics creators that we found out about in the Bronze Age. During the early modern age, folks realized, hey, what would be great is if creators actually owned their characters and could continue to make money off of them, as opposed to creating a character for Marvel and then Marvel will make money off of it forever and you'll never make anything. So what happened was the creation of Image Comics. A lot of kind of the big name artists of the era kind of left Marvel and DC and actually created their own company. And as a result, that kind of competition meant Marvel and DC had to make things better for their creators. And it was now possible for certain creators to retain the rights to their characters. And so this definitely has meant that now, for example, characters that were originally belonging to one company can now move to another. Perhaps the most famous case I'm aware of this happening is the author Neil Gaiman, whose Sandman comic we'll be reading next week. He created a character for Image Comics as part of the Spawn comics, I believe, called Angela. And when he left Image, he took the character of Angela with him. And then he chose to bring her into the Marvel Universe. And so now I think she's technically like Thor's sister he never knew he had in the comics. But as a result, because he owns that character, he could make that decision. Like when he left Image, he could take it with him and continue to make money off of her. He didn't just have to, I don't know whether he sold it to Marvel or whether he's, just licensed it to them. But either way, he actually has gotten money off of it in ways that those original creators of these big characters never did. In addition, some of these creator-owned comics published by the Image Comics, the creator-owned, and other ones like it, other smaller comics publishers like Dark Horse and such, they become kind of a thing and hit it big. We have, here in 2003, The Walking Dead begins, the comic. This is what The Walking Dead, the TV show, is based on, by Robert Kirkman. And he owns the rights to The Walking Dead, not Image. And so he's the one who's been making money off of The Walking Dead TV show and The Walking Dead, like mobile games and The Walking Dead, Magic the Gathering Secret Lair, all that stuff he makes money off of because he owns it. The TV show, all of this. He also is the creator of Invincible, which was recently made into an Amazon show. And he's also created some other stuff for like Marvel and DC. Like for Marvel, he created Marvel Zombies, and I think he created something for DC, but I'm not remembering it at this moment. Other kind of indie comics from this era that really hit it big, we have Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life, which is the beginning of a series of comics about a character named Scott Pilgrim by Brian Lee O'Malley. Obviously, this gets made into an Edgar Wright movie, Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which was not hugely successful in the theaters, but did kind of become a big kind of cult classic. And it was a major Hollywood movie. And quite a few of these kind of indie comics have kind of hit it big in the sense that like Brian K. Vaughan is one of those creators who created characters for Marvel, like the Runaways, but he also created his own stories that he makes money off of. He created Why the Last Man, which this currently did a TV series of that's I believe is currently airing. He's a co-creator of Saga, the indie comic that I think last I heard was optioned for a series, I think by maybe HBO. Someplace with a lot of money to throw at it. And so these underground comics become independent comics. These independent comics become big enough that like things like The Boys and Invincible and Road to Perdition and Ghost World and The Walking Dead, all these get like TV shows or movies in ways that non-Marvel or DC stuff probably wouldn't have gotten before. So that kind of brings us to something closer to the present. We're still about 20 years behind, but they're really the main differences between then and now have to do with increase in digital distribution. So there's an emphasis less on like actual floppy comic books and more it's like reading comics on your phone or your tablet, and also an emphasis on kind of diversity representation in comics, which is not without its own backlash, and we'll talk about that later. But so that kind of brings us to something close to the present on the history of mostly superhero comics. There's a lot of other stuff we haven't talked about, but we will as the semester goes on. So non-American comics, web comics, newspaper comics, all of these are things that we will be spending a little more time on. But for the history of American comics, it tends to revolve around superheroes and underground comics. So that's indeed what we focus on. So that brings us to the end of this. For next week, we will be looking at the issue of Samian called Ramadan. I'll be doing a video on kind of the basics of comics analysis. And then we'll be doing a discussion post on kind of you using those tools to try to analyze it and see what you come up with. What are the things you come up with as a class? What are the things we come up with differently from each other? And definitely we're going to have, I think, some interesting things to do with it. So I will see you in that video. For now, hopefully you've enjoyed this sort of postage stamp history. And we'll be looking at quite a few of these things in more detail later on. Whether that's autobiographical comics, whether that's non-American comics, whether that's indie comics and underground comics, or even superhero comics. So I will see you in our next video.